Hey gang, thanks for joining me for Two Texas Lobsters React. And this video is dedicated to Sam and Nadine, Denzel and Atlanta, your New Zealand family. Been watching you guys for a long time, and being that you spend so much time watching and learning about the United States, I thought it would be fun to learn a little bit about where you're from. So this video is dedicated to your family. Thank you for all the enjoyment you've given me over the year or two that I've been watching you. This video is entitled Why 80% of New Zealand is Empty. So I thought that would be a good one to start on and learn a little bit about you guys. Here we go.
This is New Zealand, and this is where people actually live in New Zealand. As you can see, nearly 80% of the country's land area is completely uninhabited by humans. Which is kind of weird when you think about it at first, because New Zealand is both probably bigger than you think it is and has a very good climate for people to live in. The South Island and the North Island are respectively the 12th and 14th largest islands in the world, and if placed over the United States, they would stretch across the east coast from Florida up through Pennsylvania. Together, the two main islands in New Zealand are even larger than the United Kingdom, and just like the UK, they share an almost identical climate, with similar temperatures all throughout the year and similar levels of rainfall. The Köppen-designated climate type for the UK, Ireland, and the vast majority of New Zealand is oceanic and temperate, typically consisting of no dry season, warm summers, and mild winters. If you look at a worldwide map of where this climate type and similar climates can be found, they include several of the most densely populated places in the world, like most of Western Europe, Vancouver, Mexico City, Lima and Cusco, Johannesburg, and the actually settled parts of southeastern Australia. One of the largest outliers here is, of course, New Zealand, who, despite having an overall climate that is nearly identical to the United Kingdom and is even larger in size, it's also vastly less populated. The UK has a population today that is nearing 69 million people, while New Zealand barely has a hair more than 5 million, or nearly 14 times fewer people. In fact, New Zealand's combined landmass has a lower population than a ton of other smaller islands around the world.
You guys are so you guys are so lucky. I mean, we are so overpopulated in the United States. I'm from Texas, actually, and I know that we're already represented on your little map. And we have so many people here. Does it feel like you have a lot of people in New Zealand? I'm curious about how you feel. Do you feel like you're overpopulated? Do you feel like there's too much traffic? Put it down in the comments. I'd love to know. Thanks.
Despite their larger size and more ideal climate, most evidenced of all by the smaller islands like Java, Honshu, and Great Britain, all of which are smaller than New Zealand and yet have orders of magnitude more people living on them. To really hit the point home here, the population density in the UK is on average 281 people per square kilometer, while in New Zealand, it's only 18 people per square kilometer. The UK is therefore 15 times as densely populated as New Zealand is. So, why is New Zealand so much more comparatively empty despite the similar size and similar climate? The answers are complex and fascinating, but the thing about New Zealand's population pattern is that it only appears to get even stranger the more and more you actually look at it. Remember that something like 80% of the country is just totally uninhabited, but note the difference in that amount of uninhabited land between the two main islands. The vast majority of New Zealand's population, more than 3/4 of them, all live more clustered together up on the North Island, while less than 1/4 of them live much more spread out across the geographically larger South Island. So the smaller North Island has a lot more people than the South Island does, but even then, almost half of all the North Islanders just live around the primary city of New Zealand, Auckland.
I wonder, Sam and Nadine, which island do you live on, the North or the South, and what are the differences? I would love to hear from you a little bit more about your country. I know that you spend a lot of time talking about the United States, but I'd like to know more about where you're from and what you think about your homeland.
This is by far the biggest city that New Zealand has got. Strategically located along an isthmus with good natural harbors to the north and the south and placed over a dormant volcanic field with fairly fertile soils, the Auckland region alone is home to some 37% of all modern New Zealanders and is fast approaching a population of 2 million people. This high concentration of people around just one city makes New Zealand one of the most highly centralized countries anywhere in the developed world. For the sake of comparison, these are the percentages of a few other countries' populations and their biggest cities from around the world. So including Auckland, the North Island is home to 4 out of 5 of New Zealand's largest cities, with the largest down on the South Island being Christchurch, placed upon the flat plains of Canterbury. But if you exclude the urban area around Christchurch, the population density across the rest of the South Island, an island that's roughly the same size as the Netherlands plus another half of Belgium, is basically almost barren at only about 5.4 people per square kilometer on average.
Wow.
About as empty as the states of North and South Dakota in the United States. And this is actually strange today because historically, back during the 19th and early 20th centuries, it was actually the South Island that had more people on it than the North Island. Now, of course, the biggest and most obvious factor explaining New Zealand's relative emptiness is simply its sheer isolation away from the rest of the world. There are some cartographers who prefer to divide the planet into 2 separate halves, the land hemisphere and the water hemisphere. And within the water hemisphere, New Zealand is placed almost directly within the center. The closest other large landmass to them is, of course, Australia, but they are separated by nearly 2,000 kilometers across the open ocean of the Tasman Sea. And other than that, it's all just scattered islands, Antarctica, or open, empty ocean for thousands of kilometers away in every single direction. Even today, because there's simply so little to note down here, air and maritime traffic around the South Pacific is the most empty spot on the globe. It still takes a nearly 4-hour flight just to hop between Auckland and Sydney, which is roughly comparable to a flight between London and Athens across the whole of Europe. And that's just New Zealand's closest neighbor. For most of Europe, New Zealand is quite literally the furthest place away they can get without leaving the planet itself in a space. Because New Zealand exists precisely on the opposite side of the world from much of modern-day Spain and Portugal. It simply takes time for people to get to or get off New Zealand even in the 21st century.
You're very fortunate.
And it is because of this extreme isolation from the rest of the world that New Zealand was always fated to become the final large habitable landmass on the Earth's surface to ever be discovered by humans. It remained an isolated, perfectly untouched by humans ecosystem throughout all of history and civilization until a group of Polynesian explorers likely happened to stumble upon it by mere chance sometime during the 13th century, at about the same time as Genghis Khan and the Mongols were rampaging across Eurasia. From there, over the span of centuries, the initial Polynesian settlers developed a unique culture of their own, the Maori. And they remained undisturbed on the islands by any other humans from the outside world until the mid-17th century, when a Dutch sailor became the first non-Polynesian to ever discover and visit them. But sustained and lasting European contact with the islands didn't really begin later until 1769, when the British sailor Captain Cook visited the islands nearly 5 centuries after the Maori had first discovered and settled them. Simply put, other islands around the world like Great Britain, Java, Honshu, and many others have just had far more time to develop and expand their populations than New Zealand has. Many of these islands have been settled by humans for tens of thousands of years, simply because they exist nearer to the edges of major continental landmasses and were thus discovered by people millennia before New Zealand ever was. As recently as the 13th century, New Zealand's human population was literally 0, whereas other medieval islands like Japan and Great Britain already numbered in the millions.
Wow.
About where New Zealand is only at today in the 21st century. Having more people to start with simply means having more people later on, as more people are available to reproduce. And the Maori of New Zealand were starting completely from scratch just 800 years ago, which really isn't that long ago historically. Based on several assumptions and not rooted in anything really other than basically guesswork. Modern demographers usually estimate that the Maori population on New Zealand likely numbered around 200,000 individuals after 5 centuries of living there by the time the British arrived. And subsequently, their population began to crash significantly. By 1840, the British Empire began formally incorporating New Zealand into a colonial possession, and a flood of immigrants to the islands coming from Britain and Ireland began. Through a combination of various factors like European-introduced diseases that the Maori lacked any immunities to, warfare and violence between the colonizers and the indigenous Maori, and the forced introduction of a brand new legal and justice system that was unfamiliar to them, the Maori population of New Zealand plummeted from around 200,000 at the time of contact in 1769 to only around 40,000 a tad more than a century later in 1890. But by that point, around 500,000 white European colonists, mostly coming from Britain and Ireland, had arrived to the islands and mostly replaced them. Now, initially during the colonization process, most of the new European settlers who came decided to set up shop down on the South Island, because the North Island was a lot more inhabited by the indigenous Maori, and so more of the colonial wars and violence were taking place up there, and also because gold got discovered down on the South Island. It wouldn't be until the 20th century that the North Island would recover its larger share of the population. But it was basically always destined to happen and get to the point where we are today, where over 3/4 of everyone live up on the North Island. Because, as it turns out, the South Island is actually pretty difficult to build any civilization on. For starters, the South Island is significantly more mountainous than the North Island is. This is because beneath the surface, New Zealand exists precisely along the intersection of the Pacific and Australian tectonic plates. But beneath the South Island, the westward moving Pacific plate is crashing into and subducting beneath the northwest moving Australian plate. Over the past 45 million years, the collision of these two plates here has thrust up 20 kilometers worth of rocks to form the Southern Alps, running along nearly the entire length of the whole South Island. And their name is fitting because this mountain range really is about on a par with the scale of the original Alps in Europe. There are 18 peaks in this range that exceed 3,000 meters in elevation, while the tallest of them stands at more than 3,700 meters and is nearly as high as the iconic Mount Fuji in Japan. For comparison's sake, these mountains tower over anything that can be found over in Australia. The tallest mountain that Australia has to offer is Mount Kosciuszko, and it's about 1,500 meters lower than this tallest mountain on New Zealand's South Island. Economically developing humongous mountains is a challenging task, because building anything around them or through them is just more expensive and labor-intensive than it is on more ideal, flatter lands. But taking up a lot of otherwise available space on the South Island isn't the only problem to development that the mountains here pose. They extend for about 500 kilometers across the whole island and carve out only a narrow strip of land to their west that is actually exposed to the prevailing westerly winds that blow across the Tasman Sea. So as a consequence, moist air blowing with the prevailing winds will almost immediately hit the Southern Alps, which will form clouds that dump a torrential amount of rainfall all across the narrow western coastal strip. But as the winds travel further over the mountains, they lose their moisture and get warmer as they cross over and then descend down towards the mountain's eastern side, where they then become hot and dry winds that blow across the island's eastern side. As a result, not only do the mountains on the South Island take up a lot of the available space away from development, but they cast a deep rain shadow across the flat plains of the island's eastern half that turns them generally into arid plains, and often subjugates them to drought-like conditions. So essentially, land on the eastern side of the island is generally flatter and easier to develop, but it also receives too little rainfall to make growing crops a sustainable venture. While the western side of the island is extremely rugged with far less available flat space and probably too much rain. Conversely, while still fairly mountainous in its own right, the North Island is a lot less mountainous than the South Island is. There's more available flat land up there that's easier to develop. Rainfall across the North Island is more evenly distributed and predictable than the South Island since there aren't as many big mountains to disrupt weather patterns. And since New Zealand is in the southern hemisphere and the North Island is further north closer to the equator, especially extending into the isthmus where Auckland is located, temperatures on the North Island are warmer on average than further down in the south closer to the pole. And while there's a lot of volcanoes on both islands, all of the volcanoes on the South Island are currently dormant and none of them have erupted in centuries. Conversely, volcanoes on the North Island are still active and there have been a few small eruptions out of them from time to time over the past several decades, which have produced a limited amount of fertile volcanic soils on the island that are completely absent down on the South Island altogether. So flatter land, more reliable and evenly distributed rainfall, warmer temperatures, and marginally better soils all mean a better ability to conduct agriculture, and a better ability to simply sustain more people on the North Island. And so after the gold on the South Island ran out and the violence in the North Island ended, it was only really a matter of time before the North Island ended up with more than 3/4 of the total population. But nonetheless, it's not like the North Island possesses a huge ability to host a lot of people either. While active volcanism introduces some amounts of minerals to the North Island soils, these eruptions don't really happen that often, and they're usually pretty minor events. There have only been a grand total of 13 significant volcanic eruptions across all of New Zealand over the entirety of the past 1,800 years of history. The North Island itself has only seen 4 very minor eruptions over the past century, while the South Island, of course, has seen exactly 0. Conversely, Japan experiences an average of 15 volcanic events every single year, while just a single volcano out of dozens of active volcanoes on the Indonesian island of Java has erupted 6 times only since 2018. As a result, the soils of several Indonesian and Japanese islands get more minerals deposited within them more frequently from all the ash that falls from volcanoes. And so they are therefore just more fertile and easier to grow crops in than New Zealand, where volcanism is more dormant and rarely even happens. And so where the soils are consequently far less frequently fertilized naturally. So ultimately, because of all the mountains, dormant volcanoes, hills, and arid plains taking up most of the space, accompanied by weird rainfall patterns and a lack of very good soil, the vast majority of New Zealand is simply not very good for commercial crop growing. Less than 2% of the country's total landmass is actually considered arable and suitable for crop cultivation, a percentage that is actually comparable to countries like Jordan and Somalia, that each largely exist in a much more hostile desert environment. But unlike those countries in the desert, while New Zealand's land is mostly not very suitable for crop growing, its temperate climate, easily available water in some locations, and plentiful grasses make it largely perfect for grazing and ranching. So instead of growing crops, New Zealand just brought in a ton of cows and sheep and built its entire agricultural industry off of animals instead. The meme about there being more sheep in New Zealand than humans is very true because of this factor. There are nearly 27 million sheep on the islands today in comparison to just 5.1 million humans.
So I wonder if a large percentage of your protein intake is sheep as opposed to cow or anything else for that matter.
And with sheep, New Zealand found its perfect niche in the world market, because they are now the #1 largest exporter of sheep products like wool and mutton in the world.
Pretty cool.
But that's not even their largest export. New Zealand also has more than twice as many cows on their islands as they do people. And so it's actually dairy products that they produce from all these cows that make up their largest single export. So despite only 2% of their land being considered arable, 55% of New Zealand's land is still being used for agriculture anyway. It's just pretty much all being used for raising animals instead of growing crops. In a way, New Zealand's geography sort of forced it into basically becoming an offshore European ranch. After the gold ran out in the late 19th century, there weren't really any other lucrative minerals around to dig up or any oil and gas to extract and sell to world markets. Its very limited ability to grow crops and remoteness from the rest of the world essentially ensured that despite their large geographic size, the islands would always have a fairly small population. And a small population, plus the very far distance away from the primary 3 global consumer markets in Europe, East Asia, and North America, meant that New Zealand would never be able to develop a competitive manufacturing sector like happened in other island states like Japan and the United Kingdom, who can both grow a lot more food to sustain more people and are closer by to major consumer markets to export their finished goods to. Thus, New Zealand's only ability to generate capital through exports was by raising biological animal resources like sheep and cows, which they are very, very good at producing and trade in exchange for things like manufactured products and oil and gas. In fact, New Zealand now produces so much food through this process that they produce enough to feed around 40 million people a year, or around 8 times their own population. Obviously, they don't really need that much food, so 95% of it gets exported to over 100 different countries around the world, which in 2019 earned them over 46 billion New Zealand dollars in revenue. Animal agriculture is the primary pillar of New Zealand's exports. It has been that way for nearly 200 years and will likely continue being that way in the future, because it's really the only competitive export that geography actually grants New Zealand. But because that's the case, animal agriculture takes up over half of New Zealand's total available land, and so limits the ability for people to spread out and settle across the islands even further. And then, just like in the rest of the developed world, New Zealand's birth rates have also dropped beneath the natural replacement level. But they haven't been there for as long as they have been in other countries. As recently as 2010, the birth rate in New Zealand was still 2.1 children per woman on average, precisely at the level required to keep the population stable. As of 2022, the rate has slightly decreased beneath the replacement level to 1.8 children per woman, but that is still higher than in many other developed countries like Germany, Italy, Japan, and South Korea. And unlike Japan and South Korea, New Zealand has and continues to have a very long history of immigration to the islands from abroad. New Zealand itself is a settler society where no human being there today has any direct ancestry from the islands going back beyond 800 years, and where nearly all of the European descended population doesn't even have ancestry there going back 200 years. Throughout its history since 1840, when the British began the period of mass immigration, most of New Zealand's population growth has always come from immigrants. But the pace of immigration has recently begun growing even faster. For about a century after the British began mass migration to New Zealand, racist policies were put into place that deliberately restricted the numbers of non-white immigrants allowed to come to the islands, which kept the numbers of immigrants coming in artificially capped and limited growth and density. After all, there were only really so many white Europeans who wanted to uproot their lives and travel to the opposite end of the world for a new life in New Zealand. It therefore took centuries after its initial discovery by the Maori for New Zealand to even hit 1 million people around 1911. The racist policies restricting the numbers of non-whites coming in were only relaxed after World War II. And so it took another 45 years from 1 million people for them to hit 2 million. Then another 20 years to hit 3 million, and then another 30 years to hit 4 million. But after 4 million people were reached in 2006, it only took a mere 14 more years to add in another million people and reach 5 million by 2020. And the vast majority of all that recent growth came from immigration from new places. Beginning in 2008, the New Zealand government set a target of 45,000 new immigrants to the country a year, plus an additional tolerance of up to 5,000 more. Between 2013 and 2018 alone, 270,000 new immigrants came to New Zealand from abroad. The United Kingdom still represents the largest single country that immigrants come to New Zealand from, as former UK residents still represent roughly 1 in 20 people in the country, but most immigrants today don't come from Europe as a whole any longer. They're coming from Asia instead, and primarily from China, India, and the Philippines. Today, over 27% of the whole New Zealand population were born somewhere else outside of the country, a rate that is among the highest seen anywhere in the world, and a rate that is likely to continue increasing even further in the future. But the new immigrants who are coming to the country aren't settling everywhere all at once. For the most part, they're basically just settling around the largest city with the best flight connections to the outside world where they originally came from, Auckland. Between the 20 years between 1996 and 2016, more than half of all New Zealand's total population growth took place exclusively around the Auckland region, a growth rate that many in the city are concerned is not very sustainable. By 2022, the average house price in Auckland had swelled to over 1.1 million US dollars, all in a city where the average annual salary remains just 44,000 US dollars. That's a ratio where the average
That's amazing. Good grief, that is expensive. In Texas, we purchased our house about 9 years ago. It was 3,000 square feet, and we got it for 125,000 US dollars. We ended up selling 9 years later, which was just recently here, for about 4 times that amount. It went up. And we see that because we're getting a lot of explants from California moving to Texas, and they're buying up homes, and it's causing the housing market to just inflate. But wow, you guys, that is very expensive for housing.
average house price in the city costs 25 years worth of the average salary, making Auckland one of the least affordable cities to own a home in the world. So while it is true that most of New Zealand remains pretty empty, most of it simply isn't possible to inhabit for all of the reasons explained in this video. And the small parts of the country that actually are inhabited are already struggling with providing enough housing for the people who are already there.
That's why it's
in the future, who knows how much more populated these fascinating and isolated islands will become. But New Zealand's quotas on the numbers of people they allow in each year are rooted in logical and scientific thinking. They understand better than anyone today the natural limitations that their islands provide and the realities they actually have to work with. And if you're anything like me, then you're probably just as curious about why our planet in reality works the way that it does. But the world is a complicated and sometimes difficult to understand place. Science and math serve us as the primary tools in helping us understand this complicated reality. But for myself, and perhaps you as well, science and math are each subjects that have never come easy. crazy and may even seem impossible to truly grasp at times. Without a personal teacher to explain things to me and walk me through the problems, almost everything that was any more complicated than just basic math was going right over my head. I simply didn't know what I didn't already know, which always makes asking the right questions online a difficult task. But then I went through Brilliant's course on beautiful geometry.
So the rest of this looks like an ad. Fascinating video. I understand why your housing is so expensive, because you have far fewer places to put housing because you're growing animals and what crops you can on the other parts of your land. But fascinating video. I hope everyone enjoyed it. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please, if you haven't already, hit the notification bell, like, share, and please subscribe. You'll be my first subscriber if you do. And I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you so much.